Hey friends, I'm excited to get into the interview with Shane Claiborne, but before I do, I wanted to let you know about my upcoming book that's being released in the springtime called Echoing Hope: How the Humanity of Jesus Redeems Our Pain. Right now, you can check out a free sort of sample of the book on the website, and the website, by the way, is echoinghope.com. And on there, you'll be able to read the foreword from Scott McKnight, plus the introduction and the first chapter, and also get a feel for the flow of the book with the table of contents and all of that good stuff. I'm excited to share this first book that I've ever written with you all, and so I hope you'll consider checking it out. You can go to echoinghope.com. That's echoinghope.com.
Welcome to Theology Curator, a podcast hosted by Kurt Willems and available online at theologycurator.com. Each episode looks at a theological, formational, or cultural theme. We might dig into the life and letters of a radical Jewish teacher named Paul, converse about a pressing contemporary issue, reflect on the nature of following Jesus today, or even attempt to remedy doom and gloom preaching with a good old-fashioned dose of hope. This show is an invitation to build bridges between the first century world of the earliest Christ followers into the 21st century reality we now inhabit. The Jesus we excavate from the rubble of tradition might just surprise us all.
I want to welcome you to the podcast. Today, I'm with Bruxy Cavey, someone who's been, you've been a champion of mine for about a decade now. And before that, I just really loved following along and seeing the work you were doing as I was exploring Anabaptism and how that looks in contemporary environments. And so I'm excited we have an excuse to have a conversation like this. This is great.
Yeah, this is beautiful, Kurt. You've got a good thing going on here, and thanks for inviting me to be a part of it.
Oh man, it's a true gift. And you have written, let's just lay it all out. How many books have you written? And just give us the titles. Let's just start right there.
Well, no, I've only written two, and the first and most recent
exactly.
was two different versions of The End of Religion.
Mm-hmm.
So The End of Religion is the one that's most recent, but it was also my first book. I've expanded it and rewritten it. And in between, though, I wrote a book called Reunion, and it's the good news of Jesus for seeker saints and sinners. That's the subtitle. And it's really designed just to be a walkthrough of the message of Jesus, to help both Christians and non-Christians rally around the same point, to either refresh or learn for the first time what was the message of Jesus, what was the mission of Jesus, what was he all about. So that's Reunion. And The End of Religion really zeroes into one aspect of Jesus' mission, the radical upheaval of bringing about the new covenant and what had to end so that could begin.
Oh, man. Yeah, no, I love it. I have both books. In fact, I'm waiting for my hard copy of the new one. That's probably at my mailbox even today, so that's coming. So I have a PDF of it, but I also have the old End of Religion and the renewed. And but and then I have Reunion. Always love what you do. And this is such a timely thing because I know that when I look online or I talk to people in the real world, this idea of religiosity, this burden of what religion is for a lot of people is heavy and it's weighty. And so I know we're going to have some good stuff to talk about. But before we get too far ahead, some people are like, who is this Bruxy Cavey? What is he all about? Can you give us a short version of your story and how it led to your current ministry at the Meeting House and then also authorship?
Yeah, sure. All right. So spiritually, I was raised in a Christian home, but I think in my young adult years, I began to deconstruct and just ask a lot of questions. And I don't know if you've ever had a friend who you got along with really well, but then they started dating somebody who you didn't get along with and who you didn't think was healthy for them. And you might have tried to talk your friend out of it. But when you realize your friend's really committed to this person, then you have to wrestle through, what does it mean for me to hang out with my friend if that means I also am going to have to hang out with their girlfriend or their boyfriend? And I have to learn to like them too, I guess. How does that work out? Well, that scenario has been my relationship with the church. It's like when I got into my young adult years, I started thinking, Jesus, I love you, man, but this chick you're dating, man, she's a piece of work, and this, bride of Christ. And so as I matured, of course, I pressed through that and finally realized I am part of the bride of Christ, and I'm both part of the solution and part of the problem. And Jesus invites me to be one and not the other. And so I started to fall in love. I've never fell out of love with Jesus, but I started to fall in love with the church again as well as I worked through this process. But at the same time, for those of us, especially who've grown up in the church, we become more acutely aware of the closer we stare into Jesus, the more we become aware of where the church is not living out his message and his mission. You become more aware of the problems in your own home. And so the more I studied church history, I just became as disillusioned with the church as I was reinvigorated with the person of Jesus. And I realized that that's a huge demographic within our culture. Some identify as Christian, some identify as former Christian or ex-evangelical, and yet many people are at a point where they're ready to reconsider just pure Jesus. What did Jesus say and do? And then how can I wrap that up in community, which led me then to become a pastor? Because a lot of people who are just into Jesus, I mean, they've seen the troubles with the church, but then they're left by themselves with a solo spirituality, trying to figure out where to connect. And Jesus, of course, calls us into community. So we want to create a safe space for spiritually inquisitive people to get together in community, where questions are our indigenous language, where we're not threatened by that kind of processing. And so I was a pastor at another church before, and then I was invited to come to the meeting house. And when I was invited to check out the meeting house, that's when I started to learn about this whole Anabaptist thing, this whole radical Reformation, not just the Protestant Reformation, but the radical Reformation that not only got people centered on the Bible, sola scriptura in the Protestant Reformation, but got people centered on the Jesus that's in the center of the Bible. And that makes a huge difference. And that, for me, was a breath of fresh air. I had a "where have you been all my life" experience for the radical reformers, and so I was hired to be a pastor of this Anabaptist church. But for me, I was the one that benefited the most as far as spiritual life. And so now I found the place where I think I'm settling, and I'm so happy to be a part of this.
Yeah, wow, that's awesome. And you've been there quite a while now, what, 25-ish? Am I in the right zone? Yeah, so true. And I'm learning so much all the time. I grew up Pentecostal, and I'm so grateful for the Pentecostal tradition. And then I was a pastor at a Baptist, like conservative John MacArthur type of Baptist church for 5 years as well after that. And I so appreciate the Protestant Reformation and the Baptistic tradition. So I always believed I want to bloom where I'm planted, and find the good in each different element of the body of Christ. Yeah. But I did find that after a while, I started to begin to notice in these various traditions just some of the basic teachings of Jesus that we weren't taking seriously enough. It's funny, God used Jehovah's Witnesses in my life to really challenge me on some things, because I used to get together with some J-dubs once a week for Bible study. And I went with them to their meetings, their theocratic ministry school, and different kinds of meetings that they would have, and their annual memorial, et cetera. And then they would agree at least to meet with me. They wouldn't come to church with me, but they would come and we'd have Bible study. Now, whenever I was winning the debate, I could always tell when I was making my point better than they were. They ace up their sleeve. They could pull out. They'd say, "Well, Bruxy, you might be making sense here, but how can the church you represent be the true church of God, God's organization on earth, when you guys advocate killing each other for the sake of your earthly kingdoms?" Whoa. Yeah. And I'd say, "Okay, I got to give you that one, man. Yeah. You've got me." And so, I really began to consider the peace teaching of Jesus. And yet it didn't bode well that the only people I could find who believed in it, I thought were a cult. So I was like, well, I must be wrong, but it looks like this is what Jesus really meant. And so when I did hear about the Radical Reformation and Anabaptists, that's where it's kind of everything came together for me and coalesced, and I found my home. And so I'm really happy to be a part of the meeting house and the denomination. We're called Be in Christ in Canada. It's Brethren in Christ in the States. When we changed our name from Brethren in Christ to Be in Christ, we kept the same acronym, BIC. I think it was cheaper for letterhead. We didn't have to throw letterhead. Anyway, I love where I'm at now. That's awesome. Yeah. No, that's really cool. And it's cool because I think a lot of people resonate with a story of discovery like that. So many people that I interact with are somewhere on the journey of, I grew up this way. I believe in God mostly, but I can't reconcile so many things with the real world. And so what I've heard over the years is they kind of start dipping their toes in peace teaching and new creation theology. And they start to notice, oh, wow, this can actually be good for the world. Like this is actually something we can take into the world and, really be part of God's glorious reunion, right? Like it's this
so
beautiful thing. Yeah.
And Christians and non-Christians can both notice this when you just focus on the teachings of Jesus and take him more seriously. We've had non-Christians over the history of our church who have attended our services and say, I'm cheering you on because even though I'm not convicted to become a Christian, at least not yet, I can tell you this: if your mission is to help Christians act more like Christ, I think you're making this world a better place.
Yeah.
And I want my kids to grow up in that world. I remember we had a transgender Wiccan priest come to the meeting house, and he would be, you'd think, well, that's about as far away as anyone is going to find a church, some place to rest his head. But he thought, this is a place I can hang out, and although I never convinced him to become an official Christ follower, it got to the point where I remember the day when he came up to me and he put money in my hands and said, it's not a lot of money, but it's symbolic. He said, I want to financially support what you're doing because I want you to know that I'm so behind you. It's not just lip service. I want the meeting house to thrive because I think you're making this world a safer place, a better place, a more loving place just to get Christians to act more like Christ. And for him, I mean, we cried together. There was this beautiful kind of recognition where we both wished more people who identified as Christian could see how beautiful Christ is.
Wow. That's beautiful. And I think that's another part of your ministry that really inspired me quite a bit and still does, is this idea that you can create space for people wherever they are in their spiritual journey. And if you present Jesus, that's compelling. Like Jesus, the Jesus of Scripture and the Jesus of history. This is a compelling, God in the flesh, right? Who really invites us into a radical, different kind of life that, man, so many people are longing for meaning and significance. And, other Christians of other stripes, of course, they have their own sort of ways they do that. And I know you pretty well to know that we bless that. Great.
Yes.
But there is something, when you start talking about the Sermon on the Mount, when you start talking about loving the people who won't love you back, and learning to persevere in those spaces. When you start talking about radical generosity, these sorts of things, average people are just like, I don't know where else to find that.
No, you're so right. And Jesus really pushed his followers then into a kind of love, not only love of neighbor, love of God, love of self, love of brothers and sisters, but love of enemies. I mean, who's left not to love, basically?
Yeah.
Love everybody. And he pushed people into such a radical display of this in his new commandment, John 13. Now I want you to love other people the way I've loved you. That's so radical because that changes our ethical structure. So that now the question for a Christ follower is just always, well, how have I already been loved? How has Jesus already loved me? And it's so radical and self-giving and so embracing even of his enemies and so filled with forgiveness that it calls us into such a radical love that it's way beyond just being a good and decent citizen of Canada or citizen of America, or I tell people at the meeting house, my job is not to make you good and decent citizens of Canada. That's aiming way too low.
Yeah.
It's just to say I'm a good person, I'm a nice person, and I get along with others. That's fine, that's great. But Jesus really called his followers to something that would be radically world-changing, that would break down barriers and be willing to take the hit for it, be willing to be that first layer of approach that may, at the extreme, maybe you end your life, but for those who observe and for the next generation to come along, they may be inspired enough to break down whatever barrier there was between you and the people you approached as enemies. That's the extreme. You might end your life, or you might end your reputation, or you might just, someone might pick on you on Twitter, and that's okay, to say we're going to respond with the fruit of the Spirit, with kindness, with love, joy, and peace and patience, etc., no matter how horribly people might aggress against us. There's something so radical there that can begin to just begin to crack open the door where there is such division in the world currently. Yeah,
that's so good. I mean, yeah, and I love that is, the centerpiece of what you're inviting people into at the meeting house and in your books. And as we step into this book, we're talking about religion. I mean, one of the things that one of the words that I can think of in my own sort of experience of people, a word that triggers a certain population, and it's a pretty big one, is the word religion. I mean, it brings up stuff for people, especially in post-Christian sort of spaces, right? Like religion, how is that relevant to my life? Or religion, it's toxic. And, books have been written about how religion is ruining society and all of this stuff. And in the preface of this edition, you have a little section called God Hates Religion. So here's someone coming to your book who is a Christian, and they're not necessarily a fundamentalist, but they're coming and they're like, what do you mean? I go to church and I'm pretty cool with it. So religion is definitely one of those words that, depending on the context, you have to sort of like unpack for people, I think. And so I'm curious, like, what do you mean by religion? And help us step into the story that you're trying to tell in the end of religion.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Well, I wrote The End of Religion to be a place where non-Christians and Christians could rally together and realize the us versus them is not as distinct as people might think, in that, given the history of the Christian church, Christians need more Jesus just as much as we think non-Christians need more Jesus. There are some great books out there that are written to Christians to say, here's, on apologetics or something, or some other topic, here's how you can communicate to non-Christians. But I wanted to just write directly to non-Christians and to Christians and say, let's come together and learn together, not one group taking truth to the other group, but say, let's all discover Jesus at the same time. But in that process, you're right, language evolves over time. Plus, even within a certain time and culture, different individuals use different words differently. Yeah. So the word trunk in the stem of a tree, or a box of toys, or the back end of a car. And the same thing with the word religion. The word religion is this neutral word that that in the Bible it's just not championed as the word to define this radical thing that Jesus did. It's just that it's not negative. It's just too small a word to define what Jesus came to bring about, which is not really religion, but a revolution. There's only one positive use of the word religion in the Bible, and that's James, the brother of Jesus, who uses it, I think, completely tongue-in-cheek when he says the only religion that God accepts is... And it doesn't mention anything we would think of as religious. Say these prayers, read this holy book, subscribe to this particular doctrine. There's nothing doctrinal. It is the only religion God cares about is basically, he says, love people, take care of people who need your care, and go the way of the world. Be willing to be countercultural enough to love people radically. That's why I think John Wesley said, the only religion I preach is the religion of love. It's the outworking of our faith. But faith is the word Jesus uses, this allegiance to him as king and trust in him as lover. And then that brings about this thing called the New Covenant, a new radical way of being in relationship with ultimate reality and with everyone else around us, the New Covenant. And the word religion is just not tacked onto that as the best word to use. The Latin word that our English word comes from, religare, is a compound word of the word re, to do again, and ligare meaning ligament or to be tied up. And so you could use that either way. You could say to be religious is to be refastened to something important, or you could say to be religious is a return to bondage. Yeah. We could use it either way. So rather than have an argument about words, which the Apostle Paul cautions Christians against in his writing to Timothy, he says, warn your whole congregation against arguing about words. That's a great line in 1 Timothy 2, because it suggests that there's certain arguments we can have that are just about the word labels and not about substance, and don't get caught up in those. So I don't want people to argue about the word religion. If someone says, I'm a religious person, I just have to listen to them for a minute or two, and as they talk it out, I realize, you're using the word religion the way Jesus uses the word faith. And the Apostle Paul never calls us to be religious people, but he, on a few different occasions, uses the word spiritual. We are spiritual people. You who are spiritual, he will talk about. And so I think sometimes people might use the word religion the way the Apostle Paul uses the word spiritual and Jesus uses the word faith. That's fine. But I want to help us get to the radical substance of what Jesus accomplished. And I think the word religion is just far too small to capture that.
And I love that. You're talking about a word that's too small. I love that categorization, because I think some people I've heard not frame it so well, and so it gets confusing.
Yes.
But to hear you kind of frame it as, religion is almost like this bare minimum, and if that's all you care about, you're going to feel bound up in something that's not. So that's really, really quite helpful, I think, for people.
Many of us have grown up in Christian churches that had a cliche. It's not about religion. It's about relationship.
Right.
And I heard that many times growing up. And I think it's true. I just think most of the people who say it don't have a sweet clue of how true it is and why it's true. I think it just becomes kind of a fun and cutesy thing to say. I'm not religious. I'm about relationship. And I don't want to just preach a cliche, but I want to help everyone, people who say that, people who don't say that, to see just how profound the shift is that Jesus brought, and how irreligious and spiritually subversive it is that he went against, he overturned, he challenged, and he replaced not only the religious hypocrisy of his day, but also the religion that God himself had instituted. This is the powerfully bold and brave thing about the Jewish faith, is that it contains a declaration of its own shelf life, that it has an expiration date, that one day this thing would come called the New Covenant. And I mean, the Torah, the Ten Commandments written on tablets of stone, that would finally be replaced with God writing his law on human hearts. And forgiveness would flow freely from the temple, and that the nations would come together. And so embedded within this religious system, this way of law, externalized law that you go to a book or to a scroll to learn from, is the promise one day all of this will disappear, and God will be speaking directly to your heart, and we'll be around to encourage one another, but we'll all be sharing the experience we're having, rather than going to a professional priestly class of paid professional holy men in holy spaces and holy places to perform holy rituals. For us, we will be, in that sense, a kingdom of priests to each other. The radical shift within a religion that says, by the way, it's going to end soon. This religion right now is going to end soon, and something radically different is coming. I find that so bold and so brave. And I think sometimes even followers of Jesus don't see how radical the shift was.
Wow. So for people who have, and I know this of you, you're someone who is so open postured towards Muslim neighbors, Jewish neighbors, et cetera. So for the person who says, but I look at the life of my Jewish friend or my Jewish neighbor, they don't look like they're in bondage. They're living a life that is admirable in its own right. And they have these practices that aren't necessarily applicable to the Christian church. And so how might we navigate those sort of relational dynamics that come up? Because I think that might be on some people's mind as we as Christians talk about, this radical new thing that Jesus did and accomplished.
Yeah, that's a great point. The starting point is at home in our own faith, is to realize that the critiques of Jesus against the Jewish religion of his day was against that, not because it was Jewish, but because it was religious, because even his own faith had fallen in love with the rules, regulations, rituals, and routines, and the hierarchies of holy people that missed the nugget of love in the middle of it all, the reason behind the rule, the principle embedded within the precept, within every law. And so Jesus, he confronts the institutions of his day, not because they're Jewish. I mean, Jesus is Jewish. His disciples are Jewish. It is an in-house Jewish movement through and through. But he confronts the religiosity, institutionalization of faith. And so my starting point then as a Christian is not to say, look at how Jesus confronted the Jews. It's to say, look at how Jesus confronted the religious institutions of his day, and Christianity is now a religious institution. How are these transferable principles for us? And we start at home. And so I've toured and preached on this topic in a number of places and universities, and had both Jewish and Muslim friends come up and attend the lecture and say, this Jesus guy has got something to say. Whether I believe he's the Messiah, my Jewish friends would say, or Muslim friends would say, he's definitely the Messiah, I just don't think he's the Son of God. But whatever, our religions need this, he has something to say. And it's interesting because I had some Muslim friends at one time gather around. It was like a scrum after a university lecture, and they said, I don't. We're going to take this message back to help our own religious people learn from the one that we call prophet and Messiah. And then they said, but just in case they're not ready for it because you're a Christian, do you have a version of this message that doesn't focus so much on Jesus? And to that I had to say, no, I'm sorry, you're wrong. This is really a uniquely Jesus-y thing that he brings to the religious landscape. And regardless of anyone's religious background, I think they would do well to pay attention to the Messiah, the prophet, the rabbi, the avatar in Hinduism and Buddhism. He's got a place in every world religion to have a voice. So I think there's at least a starting point for us all to rally around.
Yeah. And would that be, do you think that, by the way, awesome answer. And I'm curious, like, would that sort of posture and principle in its own way be something we could transfer to, other streams of Christianity, right? Some of those churches. So as Anabaptists, it's really easy and, easy, air quote, to say, we're done with religion. We're all about the radical movement and all of these things. And I can imagine a Catholic sister or brother or, a high church Anglican, et cetera, seeing that and being like, well, that's kind of arrogant. Like and so how to maybe moving from the Jewish side now to the other sisters and brothers. Yeah. I think I have a sense of where you'll go, but I think it's important just to kind of air that out. It'd be really helpful, actually.
Good. Well, and Anabaptists would have that arrogance. I grew up Pentecostal, and it's potential. And you add some Pentecostalism to that, and it's possible to really trip out on how you're free of all the religious trappings of that church down the street because we have the spontaneity of the Spirit, right?
Wow.
But I can speak again as someone who appreciates all these different traditions, including my Pentecostal background. But I'm not saying this is what I was taught. I'm saying this is what I learned. This is about me, and I thought that Pentecostalism was a step up because we had spontaneity, whereas the others were locked down by a liturgy and a prayer book. Who reads prayers? Come on.
Yeah.
So, right. But even within spontaneity of Pentecostalism, you can have your own unspoken liturgy, just the way things are done. So for me, my repentance of the arrogance of that attitude happened when I had a friend invite me to his Anglican prayer service. And I went there, I confess, with a judgmental attitude. I thought, well, it'll be good for me to see how fellow Christians, I mean, they're barely Christians, of course, but how fellow Christians, it's good for me to see how they worship, sure. So I went to this Anglican prayer service, and I was sitting through it with a less than stellar attitude. I remember just thinking, because they're reading through responsive prayers, I'm thinking, boring. I'm sure God is really disappointed with this if he's even still awake. I can't believe. And then as I'm having these horrible thoughts, I looked down the row of the pew that we were sitting in, and I saw this older man, and he was praying with the prayer book open, and tears were streaming down his face. And he was obviously fully engaged with the presence of God. And me, the spontaneous Pentecostal spirit-filled guy, quote unquote, was the guy who was completely unaware of the presence of God there and was only there to judge as the Pharisee. Jesus told this really simple parable. He says, 2 people went to the temple. One of them said, I thank you, God, I'm not like the others, right? He's a believer. He's here. He's praying, but I'm better than him. And Jesus said, and the other guy just said, I'm the sinner. Yeah, I need your mercy. And Jesus says, which do you think, went home justified by God? I was the Pharisee living out this parable, pointing fingers at the other guys because they've got issues with, religious traditionalism. And that really, I think, rescued me from seeing the issue here is not liturgy or form. The issue is any Christian who falls in love with their own form as the sacrosanct way to worship God. Once an Anglican tells me, yes, and our printed prayers are the only true way to honor God, that Anglican is experiencing idolatry. But the same thing, once my Pentecostal friends say, yeah, you can't read a prayer, it's got to be spontaneous. Now we're beginning to idolize spontaneity. And, the golden calf that the Israelites crafted was not meant to be a different God. It was just meant to be a more palatable image of Yahweh. And idolatry has been there from the beginning. Same thing with Nehushtan, the bronze serpent. Yes, God worked through it, and it's because God worked through it. They fell in love with the form instead of the power itself. They start worshiping the serpent, right? So I think we need to celebrate how God is at work in all different forms of the Christian faith, always be humbled and learning and delighting in that. And that is the irreligious spirit, so to speak.
Yeah,
It's,
yeah.
are you a contemporary church instead of a traditional church? Then you're
Mm-hmm.
irreligious. No. It's, are you embracing and celebratory of the variety of forms of the Christian faith, as opposed to trying to lock it down to one being better than the other?
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's excellent. I mean, and no wonder you have, from your sermons and stuff that you've done some special series with other denominations. No wonder you have those relationships, right, at the meeting house, because you're not saying your form is bad. You're saying anything that is a form, ours included, that takes us away from the essence of who Jesus is inviting us to become with him, that's a problem. Because oh my gosh.
The new wineskins that Jesus says in Matthew 9, the new covenant needs. The reason they're new is just not to swap out one brittle wineskin for another brittle wineskin and call that new, because it's more recent. A new wineskin is qualitatively different. It is supple and pliable and expands, contracts. And so the liturgy or the framework or the wine skin that holds the new wine of the gospel is supposed to be able to shift and shape and take on different expressions. That's our wine skin. Mm-hmm. And so I using that kind of wine versus wineskin analogy, I think of the living water that Jesus promises to be. You can drink that living water out of different kinds of cups. Mm-hmm. Some cups are ornate and some are rustic and old-fashioned and some are simple. But the liturgies of different denominations are the cups that convey the living water from generation to generation. And once someone starts to say it's got to be this kind of cup versus that kind of cup, I see them pictorially in my mind as licking the cup for their refreshment, right? It's like someone saying, I'm really thirsty, so they grab a cup of water and they start licking the cup and they wonder why their spiritual thirst isn't quenched. And I think, no one ever quenched their spiritual thirst by chewing on a wineskin. Those are ridiculous concepts. But it's amazing how often Christians default, especially because if we meet God through a particular medium or mode, we can easily fall in love with that medium or mode and say, I want everyone to experience that the way I did. And so we have to be rescued from our own idolatrous temptations sometimes. And Jesus, his message keeps preaching. He keeps bringing us back to the new wineskin needing to be supple and flexible. Oh,
that's good. That's good. And yeah, those images are so helpful. I think licking the cup, I'm not going to forget that one.
It's gross, but it works.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I've got a toddler, so she likes licking anything. So it is gross. It is. It can get really gross real quick.
Got an ongoing living parable there to remind you of the early message of Jesus.
Oh, that's good. That's good. So this, as we said in the beginning, right? You've written 3 books, but it's 2 books in a sense, right? And so this was the first one you put out, like 2010, 8. When did this?
7, 7.
Wow.
It's interesting because I wrote this, as I mentioned, instead of writing to Christians, I wanted to write to non-Christians. Mm-hmm. First, just as a tool for people at our own church at the Meeting House to be able to have a conversation, to be able to say, do you want to have a book club and we'll read it together? Or do you want to grab coffee and read through this book together? And so I wrote it to non-Christians in a way that Christians could eavesdrop on the conversation and still get something out of it. Yeah. And over the years, what's been interesting, I've gotten lots of feedback from non-Christians, mission accomplished, saying, now this Jesus I could get into. And I'm saying, well, I'm not making him up. I'm not trying to be just the hip, cool, contemporary Jesus. I'm really, this is more honest and accurate to the Jesus that's been in the Bible the whole time. And so I've seen a number of non-Christians gotten their feedback. But what surprised me, and I don't know if it's pleasantly surprised or not, but how many Christians said, I feel like I'm discovering or rediscovering Jesus for the first time. Yeah. And I'm having a faith renewal experience. And that's just bonus to me. I think that's a beautiful thing. Yeah. Wow. And so you come full circle. It's now 2020. So this has been a while. Yeah. And the premise of the book is the same. The heartbeat of the book is the same. Mm-hmm. But the guts, man, you were telling me before we hit record that there's been some significant shifts and changes. And it wasn't supposed to start that way, but it is now. Yeah. Talk to us about, who comes up with this idea to re-release a book and then apparently almost rewrite it. So talk about that for us. Yeah. Sweet. So it was with Nat Press before, fine publisher. And, but we wanted to freshen it up and they were willing to give the rights back to me. And, they had wanted to do a 10th anniversary edition, and I wasn't able to get it written by then. And finally, it just kind of went on the back burner of them. But there's this other publisher that did my reunion book on the gospel, just a sweet Mennonite publisher, Herald Press.
Yeah.
And so since they had published that one, they said, well, we can get the rights, from Nav Press and re-release The End of Religion. Could you write another chapter or two, just to expand it, make it more ours instead of just drag and dropping a book from one publisher to another.
Sure.
So it started off as a simple project, but when I got into it, again, I just become here. It's hard to describe, so bear with me. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. Go for it.
But when I stare into this radical, earth-shattering, explosive shift from the old covenant to the new, and I see all that Jesus accomplishes in his discussions with and arguments with the religious leaders of his day, and the accomplishment of the cross that Jesus saw in terms of the new covenant. Right? He said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." So the cross is going to be like the pin in the holy hand grenade that gets pulled, so that the whole old covenant explodes and something radically new and spiritual replaces it. When I start to look into this, to say in the history of world religious expression that the Messiah, the leader of a particular religion, arrives to say it's time to shut my own religion down. There's nothing like this. I don't care if you're non-believer. You can be completely secular. You should find the message and mission of Jesus absolutely fascinating. And as I stare into it, I have this experience of I'm still trying to figure out the word to call it. For now, I'll call it spiritual vertigo. It's like I'm almost dizzy with how it's supernaturally amazing to me that I think you can tell me Jesus never existed and somebody else made that up. Well, then fine. I want to get that guy's name and I'm going to worship him because it's so brilliant. It's so amazing that whoever had to have come up with this in the first century, that's who I'm talking about. I want to follow and I want to worship. And since Jesus was a common name, it makes sense. We might as well call him Jesus. Because sometimes I'll have friends who say, well, how do you even know he existed? I said, well, we know the message existed, the writings existed, the mind behind this existed. Can we call him Bob? And we'll call it the what about Bob theory. And they'll say, okay, all right, we'll call him Bob. I'll say, so you agree that guy had to exist, the mind behind this. And they'll say, okay, somebody had to exist. I'll say, great. But here's the thing. Bob is an unlikely first century Jewish name. Yeah. But what is a really likely first century Jewish name because it's so common is Yeshua, which is Jesus. So here we've come full circle. He had to have existed. Now we can debate, did he walk on water? Did he turn water into wine? Did he rise from the dead? But there is a he at the center of it all. Somebody had to have existed, the mind behind the message. And that's at least, I think, a starting point we can all agree on. And so when I lean into this more and I'm writing this expanded edition, I start to have this spiritual vertigo, this like lying on your back in the summer months on the grass and staring up at the stars at night and just contemplating the infinity of space. And, you just feel like I'm going to drift off into the sky. I'm just tripping out. I get that experience when I stare into Jesus. I'm just tripping out. And so I want to help capture some of that and share that with others, Christian or non-Christian. I think there's an amazing experience to be had. Yeah.
Wow. So you step into this project and you realize, hey, there's more focusing I can do on that. There's more of me probably. I mean, it's been over a decade, so you've had personal spiritual formation going on. So that's leaking probably all over the pages, I'm guessing.
Yeah, no, it's true. So I got to write new chapters on things like the resurrection, which I didn't focus on a lot in the first one, and also just some of my own story of what has led me to faith personally and to a renewal of faith. What is it about the teachings of Jesus that stands out to me the most? And also to ask a question that I didn't take time to dissect as much in the first, and that is, why does religion in so many cases make people worse and not better, including the Christian religion, when Jesus is not at the very center of it all? Think of John 9, where Jesus heals a blind guy, and the Pharisees, both in John 9 and John 5, where Jesus has these miraculous healings of, first of all, a guy who can't walk and a guy who can't see. Jesus heals them both. And in both situations, when the religious leaders meet him, they're upset. In John 5, they're upset because he's carrying his mat. Jesus told him to carry his mat, and it's the Sabbath, so that's doing work on the Sabbath. And Jesus, I think, is being intentionally provocative. And in John 9, he's definitely being provocative when he breaks with the tradition of the Mishnah, the oral Torah of the day, by mixing mud on the Sabbath, and then sending him to the pool of Siloam, which during Sukkot, which is when this was happening, there was a religious procession to the pool of Siloam for a libation ceremony. They get a golden urn filled with water at that pool and take it back to the temple as part of the festival of Sukkot. So Jesus sends this guy into the middle of the religious festivities, having made mud and smeared it on his eyes. He's poking the bear. He's more than poking, right? I mean, and so the religious leaders, but their response has no compassion and not even any encouragement that either in one case, a man who can't walk can now walk, or a man who can't see, who was known to the community, blind since birth, can now see. There's not a moment when they say, wow, or just look, you can see. This is amazing. It's not a moment of human compassion. And I think any human being, Christian, a different religion, atheist, if you found out someone who you knew couldn't see could now see, you would celebrate.
Yeah.
And I find that when I watch the religious leaders, they're so steeped in their protectionism that they've short-circuited basic human emotion.
Yeah.
Because they're so immediately go into protection mode. And so I have a couple chapters just trying to work out what's going on there with religious people who are so protective of the system. They're actually worse human beings than your average atheist would be in any given situation. And what is that process, and how does the Holy Spirit offer us the ability to break through that? And so I wanted to examine that a little bit more, which I'm able to get into in this expanded edition.
Wow. That's awesome. And, as I think about this book and, with all its new content, all the new bonuses here, I'm wondering, as we kind of move towards a close here, if you can give us sort of like the arc, like give us the arc of what you're doing in the book and where you hope folks will land. Like what's your dream for, and you can come up with, maybe it's Sally the non-Christian, or I don't know what you come up with, right? But whoever that person is. But what are you hoping to invite folks to consider as they come through this arc of your book?
Well, maybe this brings us full circle to something we were talking about earlier, and that is to help Christians start living more like Christ and to help non-Christians fall in love with Jesus for the first time as this dual audience goal, and to realize that we can do this together. We don't have to set the Christians over here in one corner and non-Christians over here. We'll benefit by overhearing each other's conversation and interacting in unity more, not just one group bringing truth to the other truth. I grew up thinking I bring the light to you who dwell in darkness, and that's why I evangelize. No, man, in the questions that we ask together, we're going to learn and grow best together. So to help both of those groups take that next spiritual step, whatever it may be. Some people will cross the line of faith in that process, but some people won't. But you'll just take the next spiritual step. Jesus, when he was asked for the greatest commandment, he says, love God with everything you've got. And then he inserts, and the second is like it, even though he wasn't asked for the top two. He was just asked for the top commandment. He says, I'm not going to let you separate loving God from loving your neighbors yourself. When you separate those, people will blow other people up because they love God, but they don't love their neighbor, right? So you can't. Christians have tortured other people and burned to death because they love God, but they didn't love their neighbors themselves. So Jesus specifically says, if I'm going to talk about the love of God, I'm going to bind that up with, and you've got to love your neighbors, you love yourself. Then what's interesting is before he dies, he says, a new commandment I give you. Now I'm not going to say just love your neighbor as you love yourself. I'm not just going to give you the golden rule. I'm going to give you a precious mineral upgrade and give you what we could call the platinum rule. And it says, as I mentioned earlier, I want you to love others the way I have loved you. So, and that's it. Just love others the way I have loved you. And so the New Testament from there on in, what we find is that whenever the writers like Paul or Peter or James summarize all the law of the Old Testament, they never summarize it by going through the two-step process. Love God with everything you've got, then love your neighbor as yourself. They actually just skip to the second and say that's enough. Yeah. They assume you're loving God if you're hanging out, if you're hearing this letter. So they'll just say, in like Galatians 5:14, where Paul says, love your neighbor. And this by itself, just that one, the second one, summarizes the whole of what the law was about. Just love your neighbor. So the religion, the spiritual expression of Christ followers should be so absolutely focused on loving others the way Jesus has loved me, which is so compassionately. I want to teach that and encourage that and fan the flame of that and grow in it myself in the conversations I have. What does it look like to have this movement continue to spread on the planet, around the planet, that says, I'm just going to radically lean into love. I'm going to let love lead me into all of my relationships, and my mentor in that is going to be the example of Jesus and the community of others who are trying to walk that same path. So that's where the book is hopefully leading us. And again, whether someone's convinced to follow Jesus or not, by the time they read it, I hope they are, but if not, I think we'll still be better off for having taken that journey together.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Bruxy, I'm excited about this getting released into the world. You said November 17th is the official launch date. Is that correct?
I'm bad with numbers, but it's any day now. Yeah.
Yeah. So very exciting. Folks can obviously find it wherever they buy books, The End of Religion. But if they want to track down your work, can you give them a website and just sort of next steps if they want to follow through beyond this podcast?
Yeah, sure. If they want to listen to our teaching, my church is called The Meeting House, and themeetinghouse.com is where all of our messages are, or you can look us up on YouTube or whatever podcast you listen to. And for me personally, my website where I write a blog, if anyone reads blogs anymore, is just my name, Bruxy.com.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I'm really excited about the book launching, and appreciate you taking some time to be with us today.
Kurt, thanks so much. I really appreciate you and all that you're doing. This podcast is fantastic, and I know you've got a book that high five to you, man. That's fantastic. So I really appreciate you taking the time to just kind of let me process all of this stuff out loud.
Oh man, no, we're all benefiting because of it. So thanks for that. And we'll look forward to having another conversation about some other things sometime in the near future. Okay. I'd enjoy it.
Okay, you got it, man. All the best to you.
Thanks for listening to Theology Curator. For more resources from Kurt Willems, check out theologycurator.com/newsletter to sign up for our email update list. For new listeners of the podcast, we hope you will subscribe via iTunes, Google, or your podcast manager of choice. If you like what you hear, please leave the show a review. For regular listeners, consider supporting Kurt's online ministry at patreon.com/Kurt Willems. Lastly, please don't let this conversation end when the episode is over. We hope you feel empowered in regular life to explore theology and faith in intelligent and humanizing ways.